We are in a new spiritual reformation. That is what I have come to believe as I watch the many ways in which religion and spirituality are changing. How spirituality is found in new sources, in electronic media, and new spiritual practices, beyond denominational identities, and even in political dialogue. There seems to be a shift in the White House toward a spiritual response to the world rather than a religious one. Did you hear the president and how he said he changed his mind about same-gender marriage? He talked about, as a Christian, what was less important to him in that change was the image and the meaning of the cross, and more, the meaning of the golden rule. I think Obama was showing his UU roots at that moment. But nonetheless, I think that's a shift. Now remember what Reformation is. Remember the Protestant Reformation. Everybody who grew up Lutheran knows this intimately. Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to the cathedral door in Wittenberg, Germany, stimulating wars and changes in the religious world of Europe. Now, he never intended to create a new religion, which in a way started all Protestantism. He meant to reform his own tradition, the Catholic tradition, from the corruptions he saw in Rome. But what followed was that members of his following started to change what they believed. Now, on the heels of Luther came the Unitarians. The Unitarians reformed the Reformation. We said in 500 years ago, we do not believe that we are inherently evil, but we are inherently good. They said that Jesus was more man than God, and anyway, his teachings were more important than the sacrifice. They said that God loved us too much to condemn us or to choose between us for salvation's sake. They said that there was more than one way to find the sacred, and even through the church. That one could encounter the sacred in learning, in discovery, and in the natural world. They said, Mr. Obama, that changing your mind is a sacred duty, just as important as setting your heart upon the holy. Now, what we've been asking you to do this year in church, what we've been asking you to do in this theme year, has been to consider your own spiritual reformation in the context of this church. So if you're coming to this late, or if you've just arrived today, this is the last day of the theme year. But fear not, you can still participate. Because our moving forward theme year has done this. We have asked you to consider 3 things. Now take some notes if you're ready to do that, because I would like you to think about these things if you haven't formulated responses to these questions. We started the year saying, where have you come from spiritually and religious? What is your past? Who are you today as a spiritual person? What is your spiritual life composed of? And what vision do you have of who you want to be as a spiritual person in the world? What do you want your spiritual life to look like? It's not too late to write down responses to these questions. I say write them, post them, send them to me. I'd love to see them. We have been asking, in a way, all year, that you make the definition of your spiritual life, your spiritual response to the world, more concrete or more visible. Be it the one that you have cultivated all your life or the one that you hope for. The more clearly you can see it, the better off you are. The questions this year have been, do you have a sense of who you are as a spiritual person? And do you want to know what a spiritual life might look like for yourself? Now, when I say spiritual, this is what I mean. Because there's a lot of discussion about this word. When I say spiritual, I mean, how do you connect with the sacred in your life? How do you pursue meaning? How do you receive grace, the gift of the universe? How do you see the holy in your life? How do you expand your presence in the here and now? How do you become more grounded? How do you interpret the poignant moments in your life? Through what lens do you see these moments? Now, this attempt to define spiritual and spirit calls to mind another book I will recommend to you by Rabbi Cooper, David Cooper. He called his book Entering the Sacred Mountain. It's a discussion about his spiritual journey as a rabbi, attending Buddhist meditation classes and going deeply into the Sufi tradition and living in Jerusalem in the midst of his own tradition. In it, there's a moment in this book where he describes a spiritual breakthrough where the silence of the moment describes to him spirit. He says he was leaving the community in New Mexico, this retreat community, and the people of that community stood around he and his wife and sang a song to them as they left. They sang, "May God's presence illuminate your soul." In interpreting that moment, he said he understood the communion with others. He understood the primal glue of the universe, an unfettered, uncomplicated, unconditional love. All year we have asked you to notice the moments when the primal glue enfolds you, when your life is broken open in a soulful way. This is why we did things like ask you to write your prayers down, and then we sorted them and exchanged them out. And you took home someone else's prayer for peace or for healing, for relationships or for brain tumors. And some of you have said you still carry those cards today. This is why we asked you to have those moving forward journals. Does anybody have one there? Anybody here? Yeah, there's still some here. For you to think about what key words you hear in worship and in the church that stimulate your life, that resonate with your soul. We used words like compassion and generosity and destiny and consume and equality and enough. This is why we held classes on values and retreats to Boston, and the youth led services here on moving on from difficult situations. What I hope you got in this year, or even yet today, if this is your first day, is that this church is asking you to be in a process of spiritual development, in a process of responding to your life and history in a way that allows you to reform your spiritual life. Not in the shape that I want you to be, but in the shape that your intuition and your experience wants you to be. That is to say that being here is an active process, not a passive one. That means that you consider when you come here the conversations you are having not only means to getting what you want, but continual lessons in how you notice things in your life, how you become more skillful and more spiritual in your response. That means that here you engage with us in the practice of promoting peace and inclusiveness and justice while deepening your response to the holy. That means that here we will be changing each other without the need of changing each other. That we break our lives open to change, and we help each other, but without the hard edge of wanting others to be just like us. We have been talking about reforming not our faith, but our spiritual lives. So in thinking about this day in church, I came across this poem that Christine has read by Alicia Ostreicher. She tells of the reformation of her own, not nailing the theses to the door, but pinning them to the bulletin board. Her proposals, many images of God. I love what she wrote. God, goddess, baby, lion, lamb, all nude as figs, all dancing wildly, all shining. This for her, the divine. Then she wrote an endorsement of loving kindness above all ethical responses, except for mosquitoes, which I agree with. But she says something amazing in this poem. She says, no virtue and no sin. So we don't try to be virtuous in our lives, which creates a dichotomy with those who are sinful. But we try to hold those together. She says, no suffering and no martyrdom, no infidels, an ethical directive. And most of all, her thesis is put on a fragile piece of paper that will be covered and splattered at parties with wine, but yet a sign that the holy will find her when it breaks through the ceiling of her life. It's a beautiful poem, and I decided that I needed to know more about that poem, so I wrote to Alicia Ostreicher about it. And she wrote me back. I said, tell me more about this poem. And she said this. The shift from the cathedral to the imaginary bulletin board is partly a dig at Luther, she said. She has a big problem with Luther. But partly encodes my mistrust of religious institutions as such. The Reformation needs reform, she said. And so does every other religious tradition. The proposals are intended to be both personally appealing and available to others. The faithful, she says, and I would like to think that androgynous image of the divinity in the second stanza and the ethical principles in the third are indeed universal. She concluded, the last stanza doesn't alter that. It just says that I want to be open to whatever spiritual encounter may come my way. She signed her letter to me. May the sacred break through for us all. I love letters from poets. I thought about that signature line, and I thought, that is what we are doing here. Here we are finding ways for the God of many names, for the ethical principles of loving kindness, for the sacred to break through our hearts, to help us find a reverence for life, which Albert Schweitzer said, we enter into a spiritual relation with the world when we are reverent of life. By practicing reverence, he said, we become good, deep, and alive. This sermon was once about reforming the church, but what broke through to me in the last 2 weeks is that the church, our spiritual lives, our moving forward, is this work of reformation. But it needs a few things. It requires that we develop a reverence for life. And I ask you, how do you practice a reverence for life? It needs us to keep our hearts open so we don't end up defending our many fortresses of what we believe or do not believe, putting walls up between us and others. I ask you, how do you keep your heart open? And it needs us to follow those key words that spark the holy embers in our spiritual lives. So we don't just let everything that we experience pass us by like a river in this fast-paced, confusing world, but that we make it into the primal glue, that unfettered love that binds us together. I ask you, what are the key words at the top of your spiritual inventory? I believe that we are in a new spiritual reformation as people in America. And it has 1,000 avenues, but few will make a difference. But here, we can navigate those avenues together. And we can make our lives more meaningful and purposeful and intentional. That is what we are about here. Making lives more meaningful, purposeful, and intentional. That is what we can do together for the good of each of our souls and the good of our families and the good of our communities. That is what we can do. But we must remain open to the sacred breaking through. The sacred breaking through to us in simple and dramatic ways. So I say, let us move forward. And we move forward today to getting very practical. Next week and the next 12 weeks, we will be studying compassion. And I invite you into that spiritual curriculum that creates this intention in your life. And I wish you well on this spiritual journey. Amen.